Well, good evening, everybody, both those online and those here in the building. It's really lovely to see you all here and to continue on our study looking in this month of Saul. So last week we left Saul basically at his inauguration in 1 Samuel chapter 12, and even though his anointing, even though his being made a king was against God's wishes, and that God was still prepared to accept that. And Saul, who really does take on a great moral authority, certainly Samuel, I should say. Samuel is the great prophet and judge, even though obviously he has his flaws as well, but certainly through the reign of Saul, Samuel really stands as a contrast in his moral authority, and we'll see that again tonight. But Samuel, in announcing to the people that Saul is their king, and really Samuel, acting, and we see him, decrying the behavior of the people and turning to God and lamenting to God, and God saying, they haven't rejected you, Samuel, they've rejected me. And in many ways, of course, Samuel speaks on God's behalf and speaks the messages of God, but also represents the moral authority of God that the people have turned their back upon. And we left last week where Samuel said, even though you've done this, even though this is not what I want, even though God should be your king, if you continue to serve God, if you continue to obey the commands, if you continue to honor the law and honor all of those things that God has always wanted from his people, then you will prosper. You will be blessed, that this will still work, that God was prepared to give his approval, give his consent to these things. Which, again, I think really does emphasize the graciousness of God, really does show to us, and anybody that just looks at the viciousness that is depicted in the Old Testament, and spoiler alert, some of the things we see tonight would fall into that category, therefore, drawing a short straight line and concluding that God is, therefore callous and indifferent to suffering and all these sorts of things, is not fair to God at all. And a full reckoning, a full picture of God shows his clear instructions followed by his great graciousness. And it is only through continued rebellion and stiffness of neck and hardness of heart that people suffer greatly and then turn either against God or learn and finally turn back towards God. And so what I want to look at tonight is how, even though things were, possibly, potentially a very, could have been a very positive experience, they're not. And even though we see in the first few verses of 1 Samuel chapter 13 some early successes of King Saul, we start to see pretty early on some fractures, some faults that start to come in here, and Saul's reign really begin to falter. And I think it's really instructive. Again, we're looking at this partly as a historical record that we have, but also partly as instructive for us, for our own lives, our own relationship to God, all of these sorts of things. So we see in 1 Samuel chapter 3 and verses 5 down to 15, that and a lot of this is in the context of war, or at least of conflict with the nations about, in particular the Philistines. So a lot of what Saul is doing is sort of in the background or in the foreground. We see him either on the battlefield or in some way being informed by these conflicts that he has, and even that in and of itself in part is informed by previous generations of disobedience. How the people were supposed to take the land entirely and to really make it their own, but they failed to do that in the time of Judges. And so, plus also the problem of intermarrying and of pointing towards these other gods and allowing, this idol worship from the nations around about them and all of their pagan festivals and these sorts of things. These things were a constant thorn in the side of Israel. And by the time of the kings, this still hadn't changed. And we see in verse 47 of 1 Samuel chapter 14, it says that Saul established his sovereignty over Israel and fought against all his enemies on every side, against Moab, against the people of Ammon, against Edom, against the kings of Zobah, and against the Philistines. Wherever he turned, he harassed them. So it's a kind of a neat encapsulation of the time of Saul. Really was a warrior king, but unfortunately, a lot of his worrying, a lot of the fights were also internal. I think there was great conflict in himself in terms of the right thing to do and how frequently he, for all sorts of reasons, I think, chose to go against that. So we see in 1 Samuel chapter 13, he's come up and he's waiting for Samuel. They're going to offer sacrifices to God. And we're told in verse 8 that he waited 7 days according to the time set by Samuel. But Samuel did not come to Gilgal, and the people were scattered from him. So Saul said, "Bring a burnt offering and peace offerings here to me." And he offered the burnt offering. Now it happened as soon as he had finished presenting the burnt offering that Samuel came, and Saul went out to meet him that he might greet him. And Samuel said, "What have you done?" And Saul said, "When I saw that the people were scattered from me, and that you did not come within the days appointed, and that the Philistines gathered together at Michmash, then I said, the Philistines will now come down on me at Gilgal, and I have not made supplication to the Lord. Therefore I felt compelled and offered a burnt offering." Samuel said to Saul, "You have done foolishly. You have not kept the commandment of the Lord your God, which he commanded you. For now the Lord would have established your kingdom over Israel forever. But now your kingdom shall not continue. The Lord has sought for himself a man after his own heart, and the Lord has commanded him to be commander over his people, because you have not kept what the Lord commanded you." So here we see one of, or perhaps the great plague of Saul's reign. If I keep interchanging Saul and Samuel, you just find the correct one and ignore my bouncing in between the two. I'm pretty sure I know the difference between the two. So Saul here does the wrong thing. He was told to wait for Samuel, and a bit like Moses and the rock, that people get impatient. People want to act on their own time. I get impatient. I don't understand God's timing sometimes. I'm sure all of us have experienced questioning, frustration, these type of things. Peter has that great phrase about time and how the scale of time is so different to God as opposed to us, and how we don't see the world and we don't see the passage of time in any way near how God sees these things. A day is 1,000 years, 1,000 years is a day. And so Saul takes things into his own hands. And one of the features of Saul here is that you see he's going out to Samuel and he greets him, and he has an explanation for why he did what he did. And he did wrong, but he's kind of got an explanation of what he's trying to cover up here. And this is where we start to get into the problems with kings. Kings act on their own decisions and not necessarily in respect of what God's commands have been. And so God's warnings about a king that would lead people astray, that would be taking an army for himself and all your people as servants for his own purposes, his own needs, his own desires, all these sorts of things. He feels as though he's starting to lose the people, that they're getting, they're worried about the Philistines who'd gathered together to fight. We're told in verse 5, 30,000 chariots, 6,000 horsemen, and people as the sand on the seashore in multitude. I mean, I'd start to be a bit freaking out, with such a description. And so Saul's trying to exercise his authority here. He's trying to keep everybody together. But he does the wrong thing. He acts impatiently. He acts of his own accord and not according to God's will. And even though he has all these excuses made, and even though the excuses might even be, a little bit legitimate when you look at it, from his perspective and when we see these sorts of things, the point is that he's done the wrong thing. And Samuel says to him quite clearly that and you get the sense here, and we'll see from a couple of other instances that we'll look at in a moment here, is that this isn't a question about the specifics. It's not a question about just this instant that Saul, failed in. That this is a question of the heart. And it's a question that his heart is not inclined towards following God, not inclined towards respecting all of those things that he should be. And we'll see that bears out to be true. And of course, his successor is famously described as a man after God's own heart. And we'll look next week at the very complicated relationship between Saul and David. But focusing on Saul tonight, and again, remember, I described Samuel as the moral authority, as the kind of opponent to Saul's selfishness, and again, we might not be standing on a battlefield and trying to keep our armies together against the Philistines, but there are things in our own life where we want to work in our own time. We want to accelerate it. We have ready-made excuses. We have the things that make sense to us, the ability to rationalize. But if we're rationalizing disobedience, if we know what the right thing to do is and we do it the wrong thing anyway and dress it up in something that seems to make sense, Samuel punctures that, doesn't he? It doesn't matter. He's still saying, no, that was wrong. You had clear instructions. You have not kept the commandment of the Lord, which he commanded you. You have acted foolishly. And of course, the idea of being a fool, of acting foolishly, is one of the great themes of the Bible. You read Proverbs and it seems like every third verse is decrying foolishness. And foolishness is so very often associated with this disobedience and this foolishness that's not accidental, that's not inadvertent, but that is deliberate decision-making, not with a heart inclined towards God. So we push on and we see this manifesting again. So there's 3 instances that really do show Saul's selfishness and therefore his faltering as a king, as a leader of God's people. So we come to this in chapter 14, a kind of, again, in some ways a strange set of circumstances, but the historical details sort of really interesting and makes for a great narrative, but I think there are some essential truths that are hidden away in here as well. So basically what happens is, again, we're sort of on the battlefield, and you'll recall that one of Saul's sons is Jonathan, and we sort of see Jonathan come out quite a bit, know him. Saul did have other sons as well, but Jonathan most famously, the great friend of David as well, and probably a tragic character in his own right. But so they're basically, again, we can't go through all of the verses and all of the detail individually. I'm quite sure that you can read through these at a later date. But basically they come up on the battlefield, and Jonathan slips away with his armorman, is the person, I guess, that carries his sword and shield and these sorts of things, his armor bearer. And Jonathan goes and kills a whole bunch of Philistines, and they start to, Philistines as a result kind of retreat for a bit. And on his way back, Jonathan takes some honey, like honeycomb, and eats it, and it's refreshing. But in the meantime, and while sort of Saul and his company doesn't know that Jonathan has stealed away to do this, and he sort of sees the people, they see the Philistines getting away, and they're sort of quite surprised by this in a way, but they recognize it as a good thing. But we're told verse 24 of 1 Samuel 14. It says that the men of Israel were distressed that day, for Saul had placed the people under oath, saying, "Cursed is the man who eats any food until evening, before I have taken vengeance on my enemies." So none of the people tasted food. So basically Saul, it seems to me, is kind of trying to motivate the people in a way through almost like fear, and kind of like, this sort of false incentive in a way that, you get to eat once we've vanquished the enemies. You get to eat, once you've done your job. Probably a terrible comparison, but, it's like telling kids that you can have your ice cream after you've cleaned your room, sort of thing. Like, there is a reward at the end, but I'm not sure how wise it is to starve your soldiers before you send them into battle. And they're quite grumpy about this. And so but I think, again, the language is important, the detail is important here, that Saul is saying this, but he says, "Before I have taken vengeance on my enemies." And so again, there's this very self-centered focus. And you remember, again, the warnings that Saul would take, or that the king would take armies for himself. And as you read through these chapters in 1 Samuel, you see that Saul literally does that. And as somewhere, one of the verses says that, he took the best men for himself. And so we see this in a few occasions, and again, he's doing this for, and we see this throughout history, that many kings, monarchs get themselves into a lot of trouble because they don't think rationally. They think with pride. They think with a sense of righteous vengeance, or these sorts of things. And so they take on battles, and they're humbled. And Hugh White, the Australian military historian and strategist and whatnot, he says that very often people overestimate the threat of the enemy, and then they overestimate their ability to beat the enemy. And he was talking specifically about the recent retreat from Afghanistan, and that even though you have this almighty army that no one else has ever seen in history, that there's often overreach, and often great humiliating defeats because of the pride of the people making the decisions. And so we see this, and so Jonathan doesn't know that he has made this curse, or he's made this decree. And so Jonathan's gone off, he's won this great battle, victory, had this food, come back, found out about this. And so it sets up this conflict for Saul. And so I won't again read all of the detail, but basically from 36 down to 46, we see that Saul is having to reconcile with this. Saul is having to manage the situation of essentially his son falling foul of this decree that he should be killed. And so he goes through this situation of taking lots, and he, verse 37, he asks of God, "Shall I go down after the Philistines? Will you deliver them into the hand of Israel?" But God did not answer him that day. And so we start to see God really retreating from Saul and from his reign here. And so he brings all the chiefs of the people, and he goes through in verse 44. Verse 43, Saul says to Jonathan, "Tell me what you have done." And Jonathan told him and said, "I only tasted a little honey with the end of the rod that was in my hand. So now I must die?" And Saul answered, "God, do so and more also, for you shall surely die, Jonathan." I suspect that Saul has the authority to not go through with this, that Saul made the oath, but that Saul could recant on this. But his pride is so great that his son, it would seem, is prey to this, that he's prepared for his son to be put to death because he betrayed a selfish and a foolish oath that he had made. And it's really interesting that the people see through this, and they say in verse 45, "Shall Jonathan die who has accomplished this great deliverance in Israel? Certainly not. As the Lord lives, not one hair of his head shall fall to the ground, for he has worked with God this day." So the people rescued Jonathan, and he did not die. So again, I think we see here this continued insight into Saul and into his scrambled thinking, and to, again, I think what's really coming from a heart of selfishness rather than a heart that is inclined towards doing the right thing, the godly thing, the thing of great benefit to his people. And we see this perhaps most famously in the next chapter, in chapter 15, perhaps one of the most, or the thing that we are most familiar with Saul, and that is of his incomplete obedience when he's told to go and to utterly destroy the Amalekites, including their king and including all of the animals and all that's there. The Amalekites, again like the Philistines, were another tribal group that had caused great distress to the people of Israel over time. Had been one of the instruments God had used to allow them to come into their land and to occupy it, and to be a source of great distress. And so God would from time to time enable Israel to go and to push back and to assert their sovereignty and these sorts of things. And so again, I'm sure many of us are familiar, but just in a broad strokes here, verse 3, God, and again, God isn't giving these commands in very elusive language or very, maybe if you get the lawyers out, they can probably justify what Saul does. Verse 3 says plainly, "Go and attack Amalek and utterly destroy all that they have, and do not spare them, but kill both man and woman, infant and nursing child, ox and sheep, camel and donkey." No room for negotiation, no room for debate. Again, it's pretty shocking. It's pretty violent. I think, we can recoil at some of these things, but again, God had reasons for declaring this, and it wasn't for Saul to negotiate the details of these things. And then, of course, Saul goes and they attack, but he takes Agag, the king, in verse 8, alive. And then the rest of the people are utterly destroyed. But he spared Agag, verse 9, and the best of the sheep and the oxen, the fatlings, the lambs, all that was good. He was unwilling to utterly destroy them. But everything despised and worthless, that they utterly destroyed. Isn't it always the way that commands only become difficult when we have to make a decision about them? That when it's aligned with what we want, if something's worthless and we're told to destroy it, yeah, go for it. Oh, there's this other stuff over here that actually I kind of quite like, and I don't really feel like utterly destroying that bit of it. And that's in conflict with what God wants. And so I have a choice to make. I have essentially a moral choice, a choice about obedience. And again, we may not face the particulars of the decisions here, but we all have choices to make. We all have lines to draw. We all have areas that are difficult for us, that come into conflict with our own values or lack of them, with our own ways of thinking, that can come into conflict with either cultural practices around us or our families and friends and the choices they make and the ways in which we interact or choose, not to speak out. All of these sorts of things. All of these sorts of things are in many ways similar to the conflict that Saul is faced with here, and which he chooses the path of disobedience. And so Samuel re-enters the picture, and I think 1 Samuel 15, and particularly these verses here from verses 10 on down to verse 33 are I'm guilty of hyperbole at times, but they feel Shakespearean to me. It almost feels like sort of a King Lear or something like that, or cinematic in scope. I could really see someone like Clint Eastwood playing Samuel if ever this was made into a movie. And again, I don't want to belittle Scripture. I don't want to equate the Bible with Hollywood or any of those sorts of things. But the dramatic impact of this, I guess, is what I really want to emphasize and exercise. And we'll just spend 5 more minutes looking at this, but I think it's really important. Again, really important thinking about the previous instances that we've looked at of Saul and the choices that he makes in the circumstances that he's in, and how this is really solidifying into a pattern of behavior. The first king of Israel, remember, Israel does have good kings, and none of them are perfect, but the first king, and again, I'm sure Daniel probably could define the history or the time periods and all of that better than I can, but it's not a huge amount of time from his anointing to this period here. And we're told in verse 11, this is the word of the Lord, I greatly regret that I have set up Saul as king. I mean, if God's greatly regretting you, you've done something wrong. For he has turned back from following me and has not performed my commandments. Again, God being very open about the reasons, very clear about what he was to do, what he has not done. And it grieved Samuel, and he cried out to the Lord all night. I mean, we saw this last week. We saw this when Samuel going to anoint Saul as king, and how he was lamenting to God the disobedience of the people. And so I think the moral force of Samuel, the godliness of Samuel, the heart of Samuel, stands in such strong contrast to where Saul's focus is. And so Samuel is, again, there's lots of ways that this could play out, but Samuel plays this with sort of great dramatic effect. He rises early and he meets Saul. So remember, he comes to meet Saul in that first time where he hadn't waited for Samuel. And again, there's sort of this meeting. And it was told, Samuel saying, Saul went to Carmel. And so then, and he set up a monument for himself. And he has gone on around, passed by, and gone down to Gilgal. And then Samuel went to Saul, and Saul said to him, so remember, again, anybody setting up monuments for themselves don't tend to work out too well with God, of course. Nebuchadnezzar, perhaps most famously. And Samuel went to Saul and said, "Blessed are you of the Lord. I have performed the commandment of the Lord." So again, Saul justifying himself, Saul kind of trying to lead on, knowing that he hasn't done that. And really, again, it's like a silver tongue, we would say. He's trying to talk and weasel his way out. This goes all the way back to Adam and Eve, where, they too sort of offer these really paltry excuses. And so Samuel, again, punctures this. What can I hear? Kill all the animals. What's this bleating of the sheep and the lowing of the oxen? I mean, these great rhetorical questions that are unanswerable. And Saul says, I have excuses, I have reasons. He says, they've brought them from the Amalekites, for the people spared the best of the sheep. There's times when it's about him, I'm going to seek my vengeance on the Philistines. But here, it's the people that brought him, not me. Then Samuel said to Saul, "Be quiet!" ! And I will tell you what the Lord said to me last night. So Samuel said, "When you were little in your own eyes, were you not the head of the tribes of Israel? And did not the Lord anoint you king over Israel? Now the Lord sent you on a mission, and he said, 'Go and utterly destroy the sinners, the Amalekites, and fight against them until they are consumed.' Why then did you not obey the voice of the Lord? Why did you swoop down on the spoil and do evil in the sight of the Lord?" And Saul said to Samuel, he's digging in, "But I have obeyed the voice of the Lord and gone on the mission which the Lord sent me. And I've brought back Agag, king of Amalek, and I've utterly destroyed the Amalekites." It's the hypocrisy that'll get you in the end. It's the hypocrisy that got the Pharisees. It's the hypocrisy that gets Saul here. But the people took the plunder, the sheep and the oxen, the best of the things which should have been utterly destroyed, to sacrifice to the Lord. Not only did they not do it, but now they're using God as the excuse. So Samuel says, "Has the Lord as great delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as in obeying the voice of the Lord? Behold, to obey is better than sacrifice, to heed than the fat of rams. For rebellion is as the sin of witchcraft, and stubbornness is as iniquity and idolatry. Because you have rejected the word of the Lord, he has also rejected you from being king." Harsh? When Ananias and Sapphira are struck dead right in the infancy of the church, it seems harsh. They lied, they did the wrong thing, but the death penalty? What do we think God thinks about disobedience? What do we think God thinks about getting it right? What do we think God thinks about details? What do we think God thinks about respecting his word, about utterly? We may not be told to go and to destroy another nation, but we are told to do things, and we are told to do things utterly. And when we disrespect those commands, when we ignore them, when we treat them as Saul does here, you can pick and choose which bits you want. We can make excuses. We can justify it. We can put the emphasis on other people. God makes it plain what he thinks of such behaviors, attitudes, excuses, heart. God has rejected you from being king. And so, just as a coda to this, in verse 32, Samuel does what Saul should have done and didn't. Again, this contrast is really stark here. And this is where, do this in the voice of Clint Eastwood, I reckon. I think this is just the economy and the brilliance of this. He says, "Bring Agag, king of the Amalekites, here to me." I mean, if you're Agag the king, like the authority with which he says this is surely chilling. And so Agag comes, and he's, you see this in the movies all the time, don't you? He's trying to justify his life. He's trying to keep alive. Anything to say. Surely the bitterness of death is past. Bygones be bygones. I know we all did wrong things, but, surely this is all good. But Samuel said, "As your sword has made women childless, so shall your mother be childless among women." And Samuel hacked Agag in pieces before the Lord in Gilgal. Was there a reason to utterly destroy the Amalekites? Did God want some sense of moral righteousness here? And again, there's lots of debating we can have about all of these things, but Agag was someone that God wanted killed. And it turns out for a very good reason. This is a guy who clearly was a nasty piece of work, and God had decided that in his judgment he was to be put to death. Saul, who God had commanded to do this, who was the king of his people, refused to do this. It was up to Samuel to carry this out, and he does this with the moral force with which it was intended. The contrast between the two is stark, and the contrast comes back to verse 22 and 23 of 1 Samuel 15, and pretty much the same sentiment is expressed in Micah 6:6-8, and pretty much the same sentiment is expressed from Genesis through to Revelation. That yes, obedience is central, that burnt offerings and sacrifices and the forms of worship, all of these things are important, but they're only important if they're allied with obedience, with care, with respect, with treating God who he is, and not putting ourselves at the center. And so as we conclude the formal public part of the class here, I just want us to reflect on these two verses in 22 and 23 and how they might apply to us today and how they might stir us and chasten us and humble us and perhaps even inspire us. Thanks very much.